We're in a pandemic. We're in the midst of calls for reform, scrutiny on police. What do you think that's been like for your officers?
Demoralizing, to say the least.
John Catanzara is the newly elected leader of Chicago's Fraternal Order of Police, Lodge 7, the union that represents about 13,000 Chicago rank-and-file police officers and sergeants. Can you see the protesters' points at all about needing reform?
I don't like the word reform. Reform, it has a connotation of there's major systemic problems.
You don't think that there's a systemic problem with racism in your police force?
Again, no, because if I literally saw officers who I thought were policing based solely on race, then I would say yes, but that's not been the case. That's not been my experience.
Many of his views are not shared by Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. She was elected last year after campaigning on police accountability.
So that the communities and police trust each other, not fear each other.
Catanzara doesn't think that there's systemic racism in the system.
Then he's got his head in the sand. I mean, anybody of goodwill of a certain age recognizes that many institutions have systemic racism as part of them. And unfortunately, the police department is no different.
Police unions have a lot of power because of their contracts, particularly in Chicago, where historically any potential reforms are negotiated into a new contract before being implemented.
They blocked body cameras. They blocked the taking of anonymous complaints. They blocked civilian oversight at every level.
The union also fought to be able to destroy police disciplinary records after 5 years. But last week, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled those records must be kept. You see how it looks to the outside world that you don't want to save disciplinary records. Looks like you got something to hide.
What's the purpose of saving a discipline record of an officer that's retired?
So that you have a paper trail. So that
of what? He's no longer here. What's the point? Or she? What's the point?
Across the country, 3 California unions are handling things differently. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose recently announced a series of proactive calls for reform.
It's our job to do things for our membership. We have that duty and responsibility, but we also have a duty and responsibility to create change, create the culture, get that community voice, listen to them. If we're not listening to them right now, then you shouldn't be in police work.
The California unions proposed about 10 reforms, including a nationwide database of officers who've been fired for misconduct, a national standard for use of force and for de-escalation, and a pledge to weed out racist officers in their ranks.
Police officers are a product of their society. And there's racism in society. And because of that, there are racist cops. And if you can't say that, I don't understand it.
But that's California. In Chicago, reform has stalled. After Laquan McDonald was shot and killed by officers, a 2017 Department of Justice investigation found serious concerns about racially discriminatory conduct by some officers. A federal judge approved what's called a consent decree, calling for specific police reforms. But many of those federal reforms conflict with the current Fraternal Order of Police contract, a contract that hasn't been renegotiated since it expired 3 years ago.
What the union does is it grieves and it obstructs every progressive and important thing that's necessary, mandated by the consent decree, they try to block.
Critics say you're taking protection of your officers to an extreme.
How is protection ever an extreme? I mean, it's our
You're
job.
Protecting those who make mistakes.
It's a union, okay.
Is what they would say.
There are mistakes made. Nobody will deny that there are mistakes made by officers, but they shouldn't automatically be the end of the world.
Are there some things on which you would agree you need to change?
I think the one common ground we can come to agreement on is that we need to be a little more human as police, a little more sympathetic.
If you're over here and he's over here, how are you going to get anything done? You need each other.
The union would be important if they were going to be a constructive partner. But the reform train's on the tracks, and it's leaving the station.
Kate joins us live now. Kate, great to see you. Last week, an independent monitor found that the city of Chicago missed 75% of the deadlines laid out in that judge-ordered consent decree. What are the city and the police union saying about that? That's a pretty bad number there.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of criticism of the city for missing those deadlines, for not doing enough, as you say, in that consent decree that laid out all these changes that were supposed to be made in the first year. They only made about 25% of the deadlines. Look, the union, when I asked him about that, says, not my problem, it's the city's problem. The mayor admits they didn't do enough, they didn't do well enough. She says, I'm not going to have another negative report like that. We are stepping up our game. We're getting everybody involved. She said there hadn't been enough intention to make those changes. But again, Allison, the bottom line is, in some cases, some of the reforms being called for by that federal judge, by that consent decree, conflict with the contract. So that means the union and the mayor need to sit down in a room and figure out a new contract, which, as I mentioned in the piece, hasn't happened in 3 years.
Is there any common ground here, Kate? Any area where the mayor and the union chief agree, or at least can work towards some sort of agreement?
There is some. And look, you heard the president of the union there saying that he believes that, behavior needs to change. He believes in training. He said he would be happy to see his officers get a lot more training on how to deal with, issues of race and other things. Another thing they agree on, follow me here, there's an idea where in the police union, it's in the contract rather, it says that if a police officer is involved in a use of force incident, in a shooting, they can wait up to 24 hours to be interviewed after that incident happens. Now, the union has argued for that because they say it's a traumatic incident. And, when you're involved in a shooting, you need time to decompress, to process what's happened, and then to come back and be interviewed. I was actually surprised that the mayor, Lori Lightfoot, said to me, I agree. She said, I actually think that's the right way to do it, that they should be allowed some time. A lot of reformers don't see it that way. And in fact, the consent decree that we've been talking about wants it changed. But that is an area where the two people I talked to are on the same page.
Kate Snow, always great to see you. Thank you for being on with us. And I hope you and your family are healthy and doing well.
We are. Thanks. I hope you are too, Allison. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.